Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. This week I'm talking with Dan Caldwell, Senior Advisor at Defense Priorities, and Reid Smith, who is Vice President for Foreign Policy at Stand Together. We're going to talk about some of the catastrophic mistakes in foreign policy of the Biden administration and what an America First foreign policy will look like under the incoming Trump administration. There's a little bit of optimism in there somewhere if you watch the episode, so check it out. Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Dan, welcome back. Reid, you're a first timer.
It's good to be here. Thank you. Yeah.
But we've known each other for quite some time.
Many moons at this point.
I want to get into specifically, you guys just wrote an article in Foreign Affairs. Trump, give me the title. Trump should not abandon America First in foreign policy.
Must not betray America First. We did not choose the title, but we think it put the appropriate sort of exclamation point on the argument that we're making.
Yeah, and I'm like the evolution of the Republican Party on foreign policy and frankly this broader anti-authoritarian coalition that is primarily aligned behind Trump is a fascinating thing to me, and that the fact that all the neocons have gone over to the Democratic Party, like I would not have put that on my bingo card 5 years ago, but here we are. But I want to ask you, you're both know a lot more about foreign policy than I do, and as we have this conversation, Ukraine has apparently launched missiles into Russia just a day after President Joe Biden gave them permission to do that. It's a very provocative act. What's your take?
Well, they launched American missiles that we had provided to them. Originally, Joe Biden had said he was not going to provide these missiles. They're called ATACMS. They're precision, I would say short-range missiles. They're not like long-range ballistic missiles. And there was a lot of pressure for Joe Biden to provide these missiles earlier in the war. I think rightly him and his advisor chose not to, but as the situation continued to deteriorate for Ukraine, they made the decision to provide these missiles earlier this year. But they put restrictions on the ability of the Ukrainians to use them in Russia. They removed almost all those restrictions yesterday. I will say it is not entirely clear if there's still some restrictions on where they can and can't use them, but they need our blessing because the United States is helping to target these missiles. And I just have to say this decision is absolutely the worst of all worlds. So what I mean by that is, one, I've said this, on social media and elsewhere, I think it's an effort by the Biden administration to box in the Trump administration. They want to escalate the conflict. To be clear, I don't think Biden wants nuclear war. At least I hope not.
Yeah, we're hoping.
Who knows what he wants at the moment?
Yeah.
Does he know?
Does he know what he wants at the moment?
And honestly, that's a good question. Was he the one actually making this decision? Was it Blinken and Austin?
Watching that press conference and him sort of wandering
into the rainforest.
Yeah. I'm almost certain that this was not his decision.
Yeah, I think that's a good call. But again, I think it's to box in the Trump administration. I also think, too, it's a desperation play. I think that there's not a lot of things we can do to the Ukrainians right now because we don't have a huge stockpile of weapons to provide them. And the biggest thing they're missing, and Reid and I were in Ukraine in June, is manpower. They just don't have enough people.
Males, that's right.
And I just say one of the most infuriating things about this is that they specifically have justified this policy change to help the Ukrainian Kursk operation, which almost everybody acknowledges, including the Biden administration, was one of the most militarily disastrous moves the Ukrainian have done in the war. They pulled away elite units from the Donbass, where the Russians have accelerated their advances since they started this incursion into Russia. And the Russians have been playing it very smart. They've been grinding them down, inflicting high levels of casualty, depleting their equipment. And so when effectively they're enabling the Ukrainians to continue an operation that they know is dumb. It's like giving a heroin addict more heroin at this point.
Just to contextualize a little bit, what happened with this Kursk salient that the Ukrainians actually invaded Russia and seized Russian territory.
Yes.
This is the first time this has happened since the Second World War, right? Enormously escalatory from Moscow's perspective, right? It also changes the sort of moral dynamic at play as well, too, because when Ukraine is valorous in defense of its own sovereignty and territory, that's one thing. But when they're actually bludgeoning their way into Russia to keep and hold territory there, and then firing these attackums on like Russian targets, now it's an offensive struggle. It's not that kind of, valorous defense of home and country. It's we are trying to essentially peel off a bargaining chip from Russia so we can use that at the negotiating table someday.
So obviously the Biden administration has been pretty intimately involved in this conflict almost from day one. We were calling it a proxy war, the U.S. involvement, but now it's not so proxy. Like these are our missiles and our permission,
and American
and
contractors going in as well too,
Yeah.
which is something I think Dan can talk about even more eloquently than I can. But we're sending in American contractors now to begin actually doing repair, upkeep, and maintenance of all these weapons platforms that we've sent to the Ukrainians. Dan, do you want to remark on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth remembering that the first Americans who were involved in combat in Vietnam, and I believe the first Americans killed in Vietnam, were contractors for the French, and they were what's called sheep-dipped American CIA personnel and American military personnel that were redesignated as contractors to go help the French in their battles in the waning days of their losing war in Indochina. And essentially, we are now doing the same thing. I think that what they're saying is that these contractors are to support some of the complex NATO equipment that we've given the Ukrainians, specifically the F-16s and some other platforms. But you could very well have military and CIA personnel designated as contractors. The risk with this is that if, say, you have, American contractors, Ukrainian base, that gets hit by a Russian missile and you have Americans killed, the narrative is going to be the Russians have killed Americans. They have conducted a direct attack on official, not, guys that went over to serve as volunteers in the Ukrainian International Legion, but Americans there in an official capacity. And I think I don't need to tell you both like what the narrative will be. It's like Russia has attacked America. Now we need to get directly involved. And it's incredibly dangerous. And again, I go back to this whole thing is everybody acknowledges none of this, the attackums, the lack of attackums restrictions, the contractors will fundamentally change the reality that Ukraine is losing the war. They don't have enough men and women to continue the war a long time, and Russia has a material advantage. The only way this is going to end well for Ukraine is through a diplomatic solution that candidly is going to probably result in loss of some of their territory, and they may have to become a neutral country at some point. But everybody knows that's where this is going to end. It's just we're trying to drag out the inevitable through these decisions.
And there was an interesting cadence of events, right? One item that we hadn't remarked upon yet was before Biden gave the permission slip for the Ukrainians to start firing off attackums, and before the Ukrainians did as much, Zelensky had admitted this past weekend that, listen, this is going to end at the negotiating table. So it was a remarkable sequence that Zelensky says, okay, ultimately this is going to end diplomatically. Biden says, you guys can escalate. And lo and behold, the Ukrainians escalate, perhaps dragging the war out and diminishing the chances of negotiations, which could actually relieve Ukraine of this horrible burden.
Do you guys have a number on how many Ukrainian, primarily men, have died so far in this war?
I mean,
it's an astronomical amount.
You're talking six figures, probably hundreds, 100,000, 150,000. That has, no bearing on the other casualties of the war in terms of, those wounded, those who've fled the country, right? I mean, that was obvious even when we were in Moldova, the amount of Ukrainian fighting-age males that we encountered this past summer. This has been just a disaster for their economy. I don't know if these people will come back at the end of the war. So the demographic crisis is obviously tap-rooted in the, the horrors witnessed in the kind of trench warfare that Ukrainian men are fighting at an average age of my age, 43. But then you also looked at those wounded and those that have, hit the skids, so to speak, without any knowledge of whether or not they'll be returning. So this is a country that has been just drastically depleted by this war.
The average age of a Ukrainian conscript is, I believe, 43 years old, as we mentioned. That number is just astounding. To put that in context, the average age of an American service member right now is 28 years old. So what that means is you have large numbers of Ukrainian men and women now in the military who are in their 50s and 60s. Mathematically, that's the only way you can get an average age that high. And so they are scraping the bottom of the barrel of manpower. And again, all the Western weapons in the world cannot replace that and cannot change that reality. And, Reid mentioned Moldova. I think one thing that stood out for us when we were leaving Ukraine is it was harder to get out. And the reason why is that we were in a smaller vehicle, but they searched our vehicle, checked everybody, and they were looking if we were hiding people in our car getting out.
Smuggling people out.
Yeah.
And then we noticed as we were about to cross the border, there was this field, and you had essentially Ukrainian border patrol. Again, this is on the Moldovan border. We weren't anywhere near Russia. And they were sweeping the field. They had cameras and drones out looking in the fields, and they were looking for draft dodgers. Yeah. And that just hammered home like how serious their manpower is, and honestly how many men and women are getting sucked into this meat grinder.
War is the health of the state.
Yes. Yeah.
Somebody important said that.
Somebody said that. That's right.
Yeah. Who was that?
Is that Murray? Is that Murray Rothbard? Might be.
Sounds like a Rothbardism.
Yeah. You talked earlier about how this boxes in the Trump administration in a substantial way, and I'm thinking back. I think it was February. Now Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, then Senator. I guess he's still Senator, but he wrote a memo arguing that the Ukraine supplemental somehow boxed a future Trump administration in, subject to impeachment if he somehow tried to pull the funding back. Do you recall that? Because that was sort of the first punch, and this was the second.
Yes. So, credit Senator Vance since the minute he entered the Senate, he's been warning about all of this, and I really mean this. Unfortunately, he's been right. In some ways, you kind of wish that he was wrong, is that some of this aid and whatnot would have led the war to simmer down, and Ukraine would have not lost as much territory. But he's been right about how the legislation was crafted. He's been right on our ability to not sufficiently supply both the Ukrainians and now the Israelis and partners in Pacific. We just don't have the industrial capacity to do it. And there is there with some of the legislation that is passed, and also some legislation that could pass in a lame duck that could codify certain levels of support for Ukraine into law. I think that unfortunately, not only is the Biden administration trying to box in Trump, but there's members of Congress, including Republican ones, who are trying to box in Trump on Ukraine.
And the most important concern that was raised by Senator Vance, now Vice President-elect Vance, I think at the time, was about the specifics of our industrial capacity, because there was a lot of talk with the last supplemental to Ukraine, some astronomical figure that escapes me right now, that it was gonna replenish the stocks, not just for the Ukrainians, but also here at home, because we'd drawn down a lot of our strategic arsenals. And Vance made the point that was really important. Ukrainians are telling us that they need 4.5 million 155 shells a year to operate with impunity on the battlefield. Currently, America can produce, about 450,000 of those. And if we were to replenish with all this new money injected into the defense base, at the best, we could hope to produce maybe 600,000 a year, right? Same thing goes for Patriot batteries, PAC-3 interceptors, all sorts of other kind of, critical infrastructure for waging war in this particular theater. So we're talking about marginal improvements, not astronomical improvements that would match the budget that we've essentially allotted to these programs. So that's what Vance was saying, was listen, there's no silver bullet, right? This is not going to clear the delta that Ukraine is telling us that they need to resolve to actually operate effectively on the battlefield.
The Free Life, Portrait of an Artist is the new documentary by Free the People, the story of Cuban-born artist Carlos Luna, who fled socialism under Castro to find his free life in America. You can watch it exclusively at civil.com, civl.com, with a live premiere on December 1st and available throughout the month of December for free at civil.com. Check it out. And all that, by the way, is financed with the Federal Reserve printing press.
Right.
And I'm old enough to remember when the Joint Chiefs Admiral Mullen warned us that the debt was the biggest threat to national security. That was 2010.
Right.
The debt was a rounding error of the current debt in 2010.
Yeah.
And I'm going to channel my inner Ron Paul, and like, this is how empires die.
Yeah, and it bears mentioning that the 35 trillion that we're currently staring at, I think thereabouts, right, for the national debt, you can chalk up about a quarter to a third of that to our foreign policy, our failure to achieve success in the foreign policy space, right? So the long wars.
We just have to try harder.
Yeah, right, exactly. We just have to spend more money, right? We only spent 8 to 10 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now we're kind of dumping more money into the bog in Ukraine. So yeah, that's like, I think for a lot of folks, matters of kind of fiscal sobriety don't often account for these extravagantly expensive overseas operations. But I think that's one of the things that Dan and I have been thinking about a lot recently, the kind of corrosive impact on our fiscal health and well-being, such that it even exists at this point in time, is a product of these long wars that don't resolve in victory. They just kind of go on forever.
Yeah. So we crossed an important milestone that I remember, when I was working for my former boss, who I know you know, David Schweikert, and when you both were working at Freedom Works, is that when we were talking about the debt, like one milestone we were usually brought up was the point at which interest payments on the debt surpass defense spending, and we've crossed that point now. We're also over our national debt is way over 100% of our GDP. So that brings up an interesting issue for the incoming Trump administration. Is our debt situation when Trump came into office in 2017 was not great, but it has gotten exponentially worse. And so you have the fiscal issues that we just talked about, and you add in inflation to that, and then you add in the defense industrial base issues that Reid just brought up, the fact that we've exhausted our munition stockpiles. Like, you hear a lot of Ukraine hawks saying, oh, we just got to give Ukraine what they need, and they're operating under this false assumption that there's some big stockpile of a weapon sitting somewhere.
They just subscribe to military Keynesianism, essentially. That actually, this is good. There may be no 35-year-old Ukrainians anymore, but hey, guys in the American Southeast still have factory jobs or something like that. By that logic, right, imagine how wealthy we'd be if the Second World War never ended, right? We'd all be, living like kings, I guess, right?
I forget his name, but the so-called conservative at the Washington Post actually made that argument.
Okay.
Which one?
We should,
right.
we should make more bombs and more war because it's good for jobs back home.
That's
but
great.
You know what's even funny about that is if you talk to a lot of the guys running those factories, is they will tell you, if we were to end our support for Ukraine tomorrow, we'd still have 5 to 10 years of backlogs of orders. And by the way, we can't hire enough people because our education system is completely fallen apart, and we can't create enough skilled workers to fill these positions. So these are real constraints that a Trump administration is going to have to deal with. And I think they don't have a lot of room to maneuver and do certain things. So one kind of argument that I think both Reid and I were making leading up into the election is like, look, I think on a lot of different margins, Trump has better instincts on foreign policy and has said better things than Harris. But regardless of who is president, they're going to have to operate in a world of limits that American presidents in the post-Cold War era are not used to operating in.
Kind of reminds me of, you guys would understand this better than me, but it reminds me of George Washington's famous comment about entangling alliances. It wasn't, he was not reading Murray Rothbard and making a sort of a libertarian, principled, non-interventionist position. He was practically speaking about what we could afford to do and what it made sense for a very broke young American country to do. And now that, by the way, now that we're totally black-pilled and I'm deeply depressed about the future of everything, there's a strain of optimism in your article and in these election results, and I've been talking about it a lot on this show, the rising war skeptic, anti-authoritarian coalition that very much helped Trump win re-election, and that there's an opportunity here to get things right.
And there's this sort of native instinct, I think, especially on the American right, that dates back certainly to Ron Paul, Pat Buchanan, and maybe the founding generation as well too. That's deeply skeptical in their conservatism about going abroad to slay monsters, as John Quincy Adams famously warned against. And I think that never really evaporated, right? I think it got subsumed with some kind of Jacksonian instinct to punch back really hard after 9/11, but it's a long time ago at this point in time. And we're spending almost $1 trillion a year on, frankly, a Ukrainian defense of a lot of places that Americans have never heard of before. And that's reasonable. And that's what the founders warned about, getting caught in these sort of entanglements that would lead us to resemble more closely those sort of old European habits promoted by kings and princes to make war for glory and all that stuff. And I think a lot of Americans are just deeply skeptical of that.
Yeah, I went back in preparation for this conversation. I went back and watched this beautiful clip of candidate Trump in 2016, I think it was February, telling Jeb Bush that Iraq was a big fat mistake. And you could go even further back and watch Ron Paul dress down Rudy Giuliani.
That's right.
I think there is a strain in the Republican Party where restraint is more normal than sort of the neoconservative takeover post 9/11.
Well, I mean, it's natural. Conservatism as a disposition recognizes, limits. And, they recognize limits on, social progress, on human nature. And so neoconservatism and its belief about, particularly in the post 9/11 eras, its beliefs around our ability to reshape ancient tribal cultures into ones that embrace wholeheartedly liberalism was always out of sorts with conservatism, in the American sense. And so it's kind of a return to normal. And, we're talking about the neoconservatives returning to the Democratic Party. I mean, that's where they came from. They originally were embedded in the Democrat Party. A lot of them were working for Democrats in the mid-70s, and then they started to infiltrate the Reagan movement, and that's where they really got their foothold in the Republican Party, and their moment of true power was post 9/11. And I just,
by the way, I was pretty happy to trade Liz Cheney for Tulsi Gabbard. That seemed
enormous upgrade.
Seemed like a good play.
Yeah, no, that's a spectacular one.
Yeah, and I would guarantee, well, we don't have all the data yet, but I guarantee Tulsi Gabbard got more votes for Trump than Liz Cheney got for Harris. But, you brought...
I just want to... I need to just pause on the Liz Cheney thing for a second, because I found that so fucking nauseating, and I hope I'm allowed to say that on this show, but that really grossed me out as much as anything, right? Just trotting out like really one of the most prominent neoconservatives in American public discourse and be like, this is what you want, right? This, and like maybe we got a Lady Gaga show for you or something like that. But this is what's supposed to excite votes in the upper Midwest.
I'm like Dick Cheney and Taylor Swift.
Yeah, wow. Right. And what's incredible, honestly, thinking back now, is that Trump has KO'd both the Clintons and the Cheneys now, which is kind of remarkable, because now I think Dick and Liz are pretty much, banished from public life for at least the foreseeable future. And I think that's a win for humanity from my perspective. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. Well, so the question was who was going to first use the F word on the show? And I think a lot of people probably would have said me. It's been Reid.
I think former military, that you get a get out of jail free card.
Dan's Marine. I mean,
I used to say I'm bilingual. I speak English and profanity. Yeah. But the point about the Cheneys is that it's one of the most galling things though during the campaign. I know you and I have talked about this. Is you had a lot of Democrat professionals saying, oh, Liz Cheney is doing this because she cares about democracy. And I'm sorry, if Donald Trump would have started bombing Tehran in his first term, Liz Cheney would have been next to the QAnon shaman on January 6th. I at the end of the day,
face paint and all.
Yeah, right.
yes, at the end of the day, she embraced, and she said this. And you had a lot of Democrats saying, "Oh, no, it's not true." But she's like, "No, I think Harris is better on foreign policy." Is because the Harris campaign, and this is what we get into in our piece, made a decision to embrace the Liz Cheney worldview.
Yeah.
That America needs to choose primacy in to achieve liberal hegemony worldwide. That is the Liz Cheney worldview, and it's not a coincidence that their platform on Iran did a 180. They were attacking Trump for being feckless on Iran, when in 2020 they said he was racing to war with Iran. They were hitting him over trying to do diplomacy with North Korea and Russia. That is not a coincidence. And again, Liz Cheney was not doing this because she has some love for democracy. She was doing this because Kamala Harris was the vehicle for her to achieve her goals around foreign policy.
That's right. And also, I think it's remarkable that people have just sort of whitewashed memories of Liz Cheney coming after your former Senator John McCain in perhaps his most principled position against torture, right? And Liz essentially said, despite Senator McCain having been kind of subjected to some pretty harsh treatment in his time as a POW in Vietnam, that no, actually we really do need to torture these people. And then like the notion of Dick Cheney as some, valorous defender of the Constitution is again revolting, right? I mean, this is a guy who like hated the Constitution. He would have ripped it up if he could have after 9/11.
He's the reason I think we lost the thread. Like there was I think the war, the so-called war on terrorism, which is an endless black financial hole, an endless assault on civil liberties.
Yes.
I think I could trace all the losses of liberty since then to that moment, and he did that to us. One final comedic thing about Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney. I think it was Tim Walz, the vice presidential candidate, was talking to Jon Stewart, I think. And Tim Walz, in one of his most insightful comments, said that Dick Cheney joining Team Kamala was permission for constitutional conservatives and libertarians to join on board. As like that, perhaps the most stupid thing he said. Which, and that's a high bar. So
well, he's a knucklehead, right?
Yeah.
It's. I mean, because I think people that are liberty minded, and I certainly count myself amongst them, recognize all those costs, right, that have accrued since 9/11 and kind of the Cheney imperium, if you will, like the fiscal costs that we've already outlaid, the kind of deep and corrosive impact on our constitutional government, our civil liberties, right, the kind of skewed, we no longer have like a Madisonian balance of power between the executive and legislative branch. It's essentially just executive war making all the time. Dan can speak far more eloquently on this point, but what it's cost veterans of these long wars, not just at the VA, but in terms of, cycles of abuse and problems with, the home life and like just the strain on military families in a lot of ways as well too. So they don't actually give a shit about any of this stuff. They just want to do the globe straddling empire routine again. And they thought that Kamala Harris was a empty vessel from which to kind of propagate that.
I have this radical idea that the best thing we could do for veterans is create less new veterans.
Yeah. You probably know this, but, and during the founding, there were some of our founding fathers wanted to name the Department of War the Department of Widows and Orphans.
Yeah.
I mean, that, so, that.
They didn't even want a standing army.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
They were okay with a Navy that was floating offshore, but the very idea of a military on domestic soil, even while, like, this is like before and after the War of 1812, when we got, like, pretty sliced and diced, the Capitol got, burned down. And they were still deeply skeptical of that sort of standing army. I'm not saying that's fit for purpose necessarily today, although I could maybe live with it. But, I think
I'm willing to make the argument.
Yeah.
It was embedded in our DNA for really our first 125 years until the Spanish-American War. And, you talked about George Washington and the skepticism of, going abroad or, the entangling alliances and then John Quincy Adams, going abroad in search of mantras to destroy, is that they recognized that America was not powerful at that point. And I think it's important. Part of our history is the fact we stayed out of the chaos of Europe enabled us by the end of the 19th century to become the world's economic powerhouse. And we weren't isolationist. We were trading, we were engaging with other countries, but what we were not doing is sending our sons and our other precious resources to be wasted in European conflicts that were not connected to our core national interests. And again, had we made those decisions early on to get involved in the wars between France and Britain and Napoleonic Wars, it probably would have been disastrous for us as an early republic.
Yeah, and so that's why I think a lot of Americans are skeptical about this stuff nowadays as well, too. And I think they also are kind of somehow... I mean, I think most Americans are pretty much rationally ignorant about a lot of foreign policy, but they also know that we're spending some colossal sum, and it's close to $1 trillion a year now on the defense budget, not including the VA, not including Department of Energy, where we house a lot of our nukes in terms of budget. And they're wondering, why is the world falling apart? We're spending $1 trillion a year. We're $35 trillion in debt. You can chalk up a third to a quarter of that to like our late long wars. Why does everything look so bad right now? It's falling apart in Europe. It's falling apart in the Middle East. We've got this kind of hectoring vision of China and the Indo-Pacific. What are we getting for all this?
And this gets to your piece and the potential mandate that an incoming Trump administration has to rethink foreign policy in the image of America first. And I know that it's probably not easy to define, but how would you guys define an America first foreign policy?
I would just begin with one kind of thought on the notion of America first, because for some reason it remains controversial. And I understand some of the historical antecedent at play there. In terms of the America First movement that generated before the Second World War. But no country in history would say, our country second or our country third, right, in terms of its practice of international relations and foreign affairs. It's absolutely sensible to say America first and foremost. That should be our interest. This is not like a particularly controversial statement. It's a matter of fact, right? And any kind of notion to the contrary or, pearl clutching about what America first actually means is frankly, I think, disconnected from reality. But Dan, do you want to take a stab at what an America first policy looks like?
Yeah, so one thing I would say is I think not only does President Trump have a mandate to change foreign policy and was elected, I believe, not entirely, as we talked about in the piece, probably wasn't the top issue for most voters, but wasn't elected in part, both his first time and now this time, because of the failures of American foreign policy. So he has a mandate, but I hate to put it this way, he doesn't really have a choice. And we just talked about all the constraints on his power, the industrial constraints, the financial constraints, the military constraints, is we don't have a choice anymore. It's either we keep doing what we're doing and have a major national security catastrophe, whether it's, something escalating because of our actions in Europe, or getting pulled into another major war in the Middle East, or because of mistakes we made in regards to the Pacific, both under-resourcing it, but then at the same time making very aggressive moves that could create an escalatory spiral. We're in a war with China. We have to do things differently. And I think one of the key things is recognize there's certain parts of the world where we just don't have critical national interests at stake. I'm stealing this line from Reid because he embedded it in my head, but we shouldn't be risking nuclear war over the negligible issue of which Eastern European oligarch can loot the resources of the Donbass. It is simply not in our interest to have so much invested in that war.
I bet you if we polled that question, you'd get a majority in favor.
I think you'd get a super majority. Maybe you'd get a majority in like Northwest DC, where you have some foreign funded think tanks. And then at the same time, Europe has its own economic challenges right now, but they're wealthy enough. Yeah. They have enough resources where they can secure their continent without Uncle Sam playing Uncle Sucker for them. And so I think that, I would say first and foremost, is Europe is the top priority for changing things for a Trump admin. And I think that is where hopefully you will see the most aggressive changes at first.
It's worth mentioning that way back in 1949, Eisenhower said, regarding NATO, if we're still doing this 10 years later, it will have been a failure, right? And now it's been 75 years, right? Eisenhower would be wondering why we're still doing this 50 years after he died, right? We're still essentially supplementing wealthy and capable European states. Yes, they've got some demographic and economic headwinds that they're contending with, but the notion that they're panicking after 2 years of war and 4 years of Trump about America actually finally stepping back and concentrating on, domestic priorities at home. We've more or less, written off, they didn't have to have a military in Germany. They got to build the Autobahn. They got to finance lavish social entitlements on the American taxpayers, writing off their security commitments and concerns and stuff like that. So I think that's one place where Trump, I think, actually can make some headway on an America First foreign policy. And that's to leave more of that to the Europeans because it's time for them to grow up.
Regular viewers of Kibbe on Liberty already know how obsessed I have been with the pandemic industrial complex and all of the stupid, authoritarian, and downright evil things that the government did to us during COVID-19. Well, I'm proud to announce a new investigative series that looks to get to the bottom of all of that. It's called The Cover-Up, and I'm producing it in cooperation with BlazeTV. The only place you're going to see this is BlazeTV, so go to FauciCoverup.com/Kibbe and use the code FauciLied for $30 off your annual subscription. Do it now. The truth is out there. Another radical idea for our European friends is that maybe they could stop being so freaking nuts about energy policy.
Yes.
Because they've disarmed themselves vis-a-vis Russia.
And it is so, I would say it's so depressing when you talk to them about it too, because they know they've made mistakes, but they're, so then your next thing's like, okay, so you're going to completely upend your regulatory regime. And then they talk about their regulatory regime like it's a holy sacrament. Like that would be the equivalent of stopping communion at a mass. And, it's like, oh, we can't change it. And they almost seem like they are no longer driving any sort of direction in terms of innovation in their economy. It's that they're the mercy of their administrative states and their regulatory regimes they put up on a pedestal. And it's really is depressing. But again, they have made these awful decisions, and they are paying a price for it now. I think there are some European leaders that know that and they want to change, but so many of them still are stuck in this post-Cold War, this early post-Cold War mindset of we have to, pursue these policies because this is how you preserve liberalism. This is the future. And they failed to recognize that their vision of liberalism, which is not classical liberalism, but this technocratic progressive liberalism, is a failure. They refuse to acknowledge that. And just a final point on that, you want to know why there's hard right-wing parties like AfD and FN, or I think they've changed their name now, National Rally in France. Why people like Viktor Orban, who I just have to say is it's silly to, he's often puffed up into this Hitlerite figure, and it's just ridiculous. He's not. I don't agree with him on a lot of stuff, but he's not this future Adolf Hitler about to march across Europe. But those politicians are on the rise because of the failure of both center-left and center-right policies across Europe.
Yeah, it's there was a time, and this will freak people out on X, but there was a time when I would have called myself a globalist.
Sure.
In the context of believing that trade and cooperation amongst nations was a good thing, and I wasn't a protectionist. But now the globalism is very much this broad post-national coalition of bureaucrats that are replacing national sovereignty and more importantly, individual sovereignty.
Absolutely. I actually think there's a lot of people operating in Washington who feel better and closer connections to their counterparts in Brussels, right, than they would with, pick a guy out of the line for a burger in an Omaha airport or something. You know what I mean? They don't like that guy at all. They don't really like the things that he's contending with, probably, but find a guy in a suit with an accent over in, insert European capital, and they're right at home, right? So it's this kind of global technocratic elite that feels very close to one another and this kind of project that they've all embarked upon. upon which essentially U.S. military might is dependent, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I will say one good thing about the Trump victory is I heard this State Department official for the Biden administration speak a few weeks before the election, and he was, very careful about what he was saying, but he did say the one thing that they were excited about working with their European counterparts on was to create sensible regulations on AI, and he said very vaguely other digital technologies. And I think we all know what that means is, social media regulations, hampering innovation. So
speech codes, maybe.
Yep. So
Right.
at least one positive thing is I don't think we'll have to worry about that for the next 4 years.
Yeah, and that's it's very encouraging. If you see what's happening in the UK, I think all of us would end up in the gulag for expressing opinions that are skeptical of yet another war. Like,
to say nothing of Britain's surveillance fetish as well, too, right?
Yeah.
There's some sick fuckers.
Yeah.
Right?
So let's. I mean, we don't have much to work with, but
I think. Well, I would just say that even just if we're thinking geographically, right? And I think Dan laid out Europe really well. I think something that Trump needs to finish the job on in terms of affecting America First foreign policy is to get American troops out of the Middle East, right? We've got these long-standing deployments in Iraq where Dan served and Syria. These are extra constitutional at this point in time. Like, you can't really draw a straight line from the authorization for use of military force that was signed like days after 9/11 and what the hell these guys are doing there taking rocket fire now. So Trump had wanted to do this back in 17, 18. This is what results in General Mattis actually resigning because we were abandoning the Kurds or something, I think was what he was concerned about by redeploying from Syria. But those guys are essentially tripwire forces that are left out on the edge of the world surrounded by nothing but desert and concertina wire. They need to be brought home because the only thing they're doing there right now is essentially daring bad guys not to kill them. So I think Trump needs to get out of there.
yeah,
I think one of the most infuriating things about the Trump administration, and not necessarily, infuriating at Trump, was the fact that you had his political appointees in the permanent national security bureaucracy openly defying him and impeding lawful orders to withdraw from Syria. And you had some of his personnel leave the administration, go to the media and brag about the fact they lied to the president. Lied. And they were like, yeah, it's totally fine. Totally fine. We lied to the president about how many troops we have in Syria. Just the arrogance and the gall of those people.
Yeah.
And it's cost us lives. There have been, this also too was one of the most enraging things I think this year is both Biden and Harris saying we don't have troops in combat anywhere in the world. There have been over, I think, 150 now troops that have been seriously wounded as a result of attacks on some of these bases that Reid just walked through. We had 3 reservists from Georgia killed in Jordan right on the Syrian border that were supporting the Syria mission. They were killed. You had a 4th soldier killed at the debacle of the Gaza pier that the Biden administration did. And
there's
so
2 SEALs as well, too, in the Red Sea.
You had 2 Navy SEALs that were part of those operations. They drowned. And so there are still troops on a regular basis being wounded and killed in the Middle East as a result of these deployments. And for Joe Biden and Harris, they were the commander, Joe Biden, the commander-in-chief, the vice president in the chain of command, but she's still, an important representative of that chain of command, to go out and lie to the American people, to you want to talk about Trump supposedly disrespecting the veterans. I'm sorry, I don't believe those stories at all. But you want to pretend like Americans are not being wounded and killed on a regular basis in the Middle East is absolutely galling.
I wonder if she knows. So she.
That's a good question.
But I wonder if the figureheads that supposedly are chief executives have a good understanding of what is actually happening in foreign policy. And I'm thinking of Trump, to the extent that he can acknowledge ever having made a mistake, which is a big lift for him. He actually came out before the election and said, a lot of these hires, they were kind of foisted upon me. I'm characterizing it, foisted upon me by sort of this permanent government that infiltrated my transition team, and the freak out about Trump's transition team now being independent of what he would call the deep state is encouraging to me. Like I think he probably did learn some lessons about being undermined by his own advisors. We'll see if that turns out, because you guys may want to opine or not, but his foreign policy choices are kind of a mixed bag so far.
I think one point I would make, and I've made this point before, is, look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that all the foreign policy choices agree with me on everything, and I think Reid would probably say the same thing. But we have this bad habit in American political discourse of want to have like these discussions where everything's binary. Either somebody's a neocon, or they're an isolationist, or they're a war hawk, or they're, a pacifist. And so even people who know better, reporters in particular, are trying to fit everybody in these neat little boxes. And I don't think that tells the whole story. And I think we talk about this in the piece, but Marco Rubio, I think, is an interesting example of this, is everybody wants to say that he's a neocon. And I think, honestly, there was a point in his career where you could legitimately call him a neoconservative. And I'm not going to sit here again and pretend that Senator Rubio and I agree on everything on foreign policy, but his views have very clearly evolved over the past 3 or 4 years, where in 2015, 2016, he was basically giving foreign policy speeches that may actually have been written by Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan, to now where he is recognizing we live in a world of limits, saying we need to do less in Europe, that if we're going to truly prioritize China, we need to pull back elsewhere. And he voted against the last major foreign aid package. I think he gave a pretty decent speech in the Senate floor opposing it. And so he's an example of somebody who's involved. And another example...
Writing for Pat Buchanan's The American Conservative these days. You know what I mean? Submitting essays there. Now the Weekly Standard's defunct.
Marco is?
Yeah. He submitted a big essay there about essentially American revitalization and acknowledged some of the failures of these past 20 years, which is a big step from a guy who ran on the New American Century platform not that long ago in homage to Bill Kristol and Kagan's project for the New American Century. So interesting evolution.
And I'd also say, somebody else who's evolved is somebody who I know pretty well, Pete Hegseth, who's currently the...
Explain your history.
So I worked for Pete at Concerned Veterans for America for about 2.5 years. I've known Pete for over a decade. And like a lot of veterans, his views on American foreign policy have evolved significantly. He's somebody who was very much in favor of the Iraq surge. That's how he first became prominent in the public eye, was advocating and defending the surge. But now he freely admits that the war in Iraq was a mistake. He calls himself a recovering neocon. And if you listen to him and you talk to him, he's clearly thought a lot about this. And like a lot of veterans of the war, especially as they dragged on, as even if they became less intense, you still had body bags coming back on a regular basis. You still had these high costs, and all these places where we fought and served, were either under the control of ISIS or the Taliban or an Iranian militia. Like, it all was pretty apparent the whole project was a failure. So he is somebody who I think has internalized that. And to Reid's point earlier, is somebody who has seen the costs of this up close, not just from his own service, but because of his work in the veterans advocacy space. And so I think that is really caused him to evolve and re-examine a lot of his positions. And I also, too, would say is that I think for him, the fact that a lot of the neoconservatives that maybe he rubbed elbows with, the fact that they were so viciously opposed to Trump, I don't want to speak for Pete here. I want to be very careful. But I think it was obvious to him, like, they're mad at Trump not because of these other issues, but because he's challenging the status quo on particular foreign policy.
I think both with respect to Senator Rubio and Pete, I think both of these are sort of case studies in the political incentives that are changing. And just reflecting on the cabinet, I think it's natural that observers of transition would index pretty heavily in those kind of key national security positions, right? Defense, state, national security advisor. But the whole sort of vibe in the Trump world right now is less hawkish than it was back in 16, right? So you've got Musk there, right? You've got Vivek, right? You've got Don Jr., who's kind of advising his father on certain important decisions. You've got J.D. Vance, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I actually see a cabinet, if I think back to like the XCOM that JFK assembled surrounding the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? It's not just Curtis LeMay, it's also Bobby Kennedy and his speechwriter Ted Sorensen, right? Like there's a bigger kind of audience that Trump is now drawing from in terms of how he's thinking about his foreign policy. So I just think the vibe shift is obvious in the cabinet and with respect to those that are close to the executive right now. And that's different.
Yeah. Speaking of, I was going to bring up Vivek and Elon and the DOGE Commission. I'm a recovering budget economist. So I've been arguing with my friends about what would the practical paths to actually implementing, because it's basically an independent commission, which in many ways is a good thing, because you wouldn't necessarily expect the DOD, which can't pass an audit, to clean up its own house. It would be good to get some fresh eyes, some independent eyes, people without an agenda to protect the existing bureaucracy to do something about that. And I think they have already said this countless times, but they're also going to learn quite practically that if you actually want to tackle the national debt, you can't be in every forever war.
Yeah.
You can't fully fund the black hole of the war on terror. So thinking back to the Tea Party days, people forget this now, but we created at FreedomWorks something called the Tea Party Debt Commission, and we actually had veterans in charge of the national defense budget. It was crowdsourced, but they ended up with a military budget portfolio that almost exactly reflected what Ron Paul had proposed. Because if you actually care about the national debt, if you actually want to balance the budget, if you want to get our fiscal house in order, defense has to be part of that mix. And I think so Elon and Vivek, who would be more America first, more skeptical of further foreign intervention, are going to be those voices pushing for some fiscal sanity. Hopefully. I mean, that's pushback, right?
Yeah, and Dan and I think we would favor a strong national defense, right? That's one of those core components of what a government should do, is be able to kind of, secure the conditions of our prosperity here at home. But I think there's probably a lot of fat to cut from a $1 trillion defense budget that you could do so effectively. I don't know necessarily how that's going to work in a Trump administration yet. I think that remains to be seen. I think it remains to be seen how Vivek and Elon are going to be able to kind of shape and mold better government efficiency. There's certainly a lot of room for improvement, I think, there.
Yeah, did you see the woman from DOD talking to Jon Stewart?
Kath Hicks.
Yeah, Kath. Yeah.
I didn't know who she was. It just the arrogance. It reminded me of Anthony Fauci. Like, I don't work for you. You work for me. We don't need to pass an audit.
No, we just get to fail it every year for 7 years in a row and not have to worry about it and watch our budget grow.
Yeah. Do you know who I am?
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Again, an unelected bureaucrat who thinks she's above essentially and I think she's a nice person. We've sat next to each other at rubber chicken dinners and stuff like that here in D.C. But I think there is a disconnect there between kind of what maybe the country needs or requires, maybe some money back in their pocket, maybe lower inflation, and another expensive weapons platform that, I don't know how it's going to improve the conditions of my life or that of my children.
Yeah. By the way, like if I don't think there's a trade-off between fiscal responsibility and national security. I think they go together. I think if you have so many resources flowing through the system and you're trying to do everything in every country across the world, well, of course you can't pass an audit, because it doesn't matter, because the money's just going to flow, and that leads to failure.
Yeah, there was a recent study, what was it, the National Defense Commission, which is one of those blue ribbon committees they pull together from time to time, bipartisan. They said, listen, we're not spending nearly enough on defense. And I kind of agree with them. If you want to do everything, if you want to actually police the planet and bring it to heel, let alone shape or mold it to your desire, If you want to crack enough Afghans in the head that they become liberal Jeffersonians, like you need to spend a lot more money on that. I think what Dan and I might say is, do we need to do that, right? Is there a first order question that's not being addressed? Like, can we do this? Do we want to do this? Is it necessary for American safety and international stability that we have to do everything everywhere all at once?
Yeah, the can part, I think about this through the lens of Frederick Hayek, and every time I quote Hayek on my show, people back home get to drink, so I had to do it. But I've started to realize that, and I watched this, and the realization came when we basically militarized the economy during COVID and lockdowns.
Yep.
And I realized that, nation building, like exporting democracy, is really a form of central planning.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
And you couldn't possibly know nearly enough to crack enough Afghan heads
Right.
to get them
Yeah.
to become Jeffersonian liberals.
Right.
And the fatal conceit that thinks that you could do that is precisely what some wonk in the Pentagon, he's probably got a chalkboard, he's got a whiteboard, and he's like, here's how we're going to reorganize
Endless PowerPoints.
society
right,
in
right.
Afghanistan. Well, that is never going to happen. It can't happen. And nobody would ever be smart enough to pull that off.
They used to talk about democracy in a box, right?
Yes.
Imagine the fatal conceit at play, right? That I think Hayek would be all over, right? Democracy in a box, like it just springs forth, right? Some sort of
Just add water.
Right, exactly. Like a chia pet, and it just grows and kind of consumes your democratic instincts that obviously you nurture somewhere deep inside. But Dan, you probably want to go.
So, I think that, it's funny is that a lot of folks will say, we're not doing nation building anymore. We're not, Iraq and Afghanistan. We're not going to do those anymore. But then they use the same rhetoric around Ukraine. Mm-hmm. What is Ukraine about? It's protecting democracy, and we're doing this because it's about the future of liberal democracy. But as we've, I've seen, Reid and I've seen, and others have reported, is that, Ukraine, as the war's dragged on, has become more liberal, more authoritarian. Yeah. And I do honestly think the Biden administration still believes that line, is that this is about liberalism and democracy. I think there's people who also within the administration, I would say some of the right-wing Ukraine supporters, they just view this as a way to bleed Russia. But there's still the same rhetoric and same mindset around the role of American foreign policy is about preserving liberal hegemony is driving a lot of our decisions in Ukraine. One thing I want to go back to, though, is on the DOGE, right? Is that doggy? It's DOGE. Sorry. DOGE. The DOGE commission is, look, you I think we're getting at this, talking about your time working around federal budget stuff, is a lot of times these commissions don't go anywhere and it flames out. But I do think having somebody like Elon and Vivek, and hopefully you have a good OMB director, and you have the White House backing them up on this, is that it could actually be a good incubator of ideas to actually cut the budget. Mm-hmm. Now, on the other hand, go back and forth a little bit here, is more efficient government is fine, but you don't want the government to become more efficient at doing bad things.
Right.
So we don't want to see, like, for example, we don't really want to see the ATF become more efficient. Or we don't want to see the FBI more efficient at entrapping people in federal crimes, or the Department of Education more efficient in imposing top-down mandates on schools. Mm-hmm. So
the Justice Department jailing parents for being anxious about their child's education.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
So that's
no, we've built a bitter mousetrap. Now we're stuck in it, right?
Yeah.
So that's where we got to be careful. It's like Reid and I have had this experience around like reforming Department of Defense spending. It needs to happen. There's a lot of inefficiency within the Defense Department. But what we don't want to do is make the current failed foreign policy more efficient. Mm-hmm. Is to truly achieve true savings in our national defenses, we need a new strategic culture and a new foreign policy. Yeah. Not just changes on the margins, which, yes, are probably needed to make things more efficient and less, wasteful, but a true fundamental strategic culture shift.
Yeah, and I see the rhetoric coming from Musk and Ramaswamy is structural change, not...
Yes.
We're not just going to stop the programs where we give rats cocaine and watch them have sex. I mean, we should cut those too, but that's not going to make a difference either way.
Do that in your own time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, some of us pay good money for those.
Right.
So let's I think we're running out of time here, but let's get an update from both of you about what's going on in your world. I'll start with you. Like, what are the priorities?
Yeah.
And you're at Stand Together, right?
I'm at Stand Together, where I'm the vice president for foreign policy, attentive to our kind of broad philanthropic strategy and policy advocacy in the foreign policy space, broadly understood. So I think we're going to call balls and strikes in the new administration, right? If the Trump administration wants to do something we think is good, we're going to celebrate that. If the Trump administration is going to go in the wrong direction, I think we're going to try to offer some alternatives for course correction. I think we see big opportunities, some of which we've discussed. I believe that President Trump can affect termination of the war in Ukraine. I think he can shift a lot of burden, fiscal and military, to Europe, and I think he can get us out of some sticky wickets in the Middle East. And I think also what I'd really like to see in this administration is a lot of good people go in and get the sorts of credentials that will give them opportunities down the road in other administrations that might share some of our perspectives. I think the selection of Vance is really, I don't think we've really talked about that. I just want to remark on that really quickly. Senator Vance is 39 years old, maybe 40. This guy's got a long career ahead of him. I think he shares a lot of my priors, Dan's priors on foreign policy. I think this might be one of the more important kind of shifts in terms of current that we're going to witness in Republican politics over the long run. And I think that's why a lot of neoconservatives and other more conventional hawks we're not particularly happy about the selection of Vance to begin with, because man, he's got a long run ahead of him, and I think he's probably indicative of some generational change on foreign policy in addition to some of those political instincts at the meta level.
For us at Defense Priorities is a policy organization that's focused on advancing a foreign policy of realism and restraint. What we're really focused on is providing ideas and not just to the administration, but to Congress and people in other parts of the think tank space on how can we operationalize some of these promises that Trump has made. What are ways that you can drive a negotiated settlement in Ukraine? So what's good? What's bad? What are things that should be on the table? What are things that shouldn't be on the table? So, for example, looking at things like security guarantees. Should we keep the door open for NATO? I think we would say at Defense Priorities, absolutely no, we should shut the door. But what are some ways that you can incentivize Ukraine and make them feel like the war is not a total loss? And, looking at things like force structure, so trying to provide that intellectual ammunition for people outside and inside both the Trump administration and Congress to make an argument for a more restrained foreign policy. And I think Reid is going to have a big focus on this too, is you're going to see a lot of that really play out in the first 100 days on a whole host of policies. But I would say foreign policy in particular is the first 100 days are really going to be critical around a lot of issues.
So people can check out I got my first free article from Foreign Affairs and use your free article on this. What's the title of the article again?
President Trump must not betray America first.
And you guys are both on social media. I follow you both on X. What's your handle? Do you remember?
At Dan D. Caldwell.
And at Reid T. Smith. Yeah.
We need to get Reid to X. Was it X more? Tweet more?
He
needs to do that.
I'm a reluctant poster.
It's time. Like X is where the revolution's going to happen.
That's a fact.
And we're allowed to say things that we're not allowed to say on YouTube or Facebook. So you got to be there. Thanks. This is very enlightening and cautiously hopeful that we can make some progress.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.